Okay, so this is a continuation from class. I think every class got at least to Levitt towns. And so if you recall, in class, I was talking about the importance of not only the automobile, but also the importance of federal funding of internal improvements, such as highway building. We're going to see these two kind of combined things, also with pent up consumer demand and savings. Um, really lead to the development and proliferation of suburbs. And one of the model suburbs that develops back on the East Coast by this guy named William Levitt are called Levittowns. And you can see a Levittown here, and they developed later in other places as well. But the first one was on Long Island in New York. And you can see that the houses are very similar. Typically, at least the early ones didn't have a garage, but you can see the ones that are in this picture do. Usually that was a single car garage if they had one. You would have a kitchen, like a living room, a dining area, two bedrooms, one bath, and typically one tree. And the idea behind the Levittown was bringing that idea of Fordism of mass production, assembly line production to mass produce houses. And I mean, these houses were relatively affordable. The first ones were under $10,000. Now you combine that with the GI Bill of Rights, which allowed a lot of veterans to move out to the suburbs. You have an expanding middle class. And so what we get is this great era of white flight out to the suburbs. Okay. Now, life in suburbia was a little bit different. Okay. Most people that lived in suburbia worked, closer to downtown. So they had to build roads. I mean, you can imagine this is not great for the environment. This is where we start to see things like traffic jams. We see things like, smog start to appear, above cities that is the result of gases produced from driving vehicles. We're going to see, the development of things like gas stations, shopping malls. I would even write down fast food. It's really because of suburbia and the automobile that we get things like fast food. Now, the first fast food places were what were called drive-ins. And if you've never experienced a drive-in, the idea was there that you wouldn't go sit inside the restaurant. You would drive up, and then usually a car hop or somebody would come take your order, and then they would come with a tray. And the little tray had a hook or a couple of hooks that would hook onto your window. So you'd roll your window down partially, and then you'd put the tray on there. And that's where you would eat. And so we start to really see things like fast food and then large shopping malls develop as a result of this. Now, life in suburbia, and that is to say, life for middle class, typically white Americans. It was a very homogenous experience in a lot of ways. There was this idea of, domesticity for women. Women were supposed to, subvert their own ideas, their own lives to the betterment of their family. And so, we see this in terms of what kind of families we see out in suburbia. All right. And so let's kind of write down a few of these things. So the first question there is like, why? Well, people go out to the suburbs because they're safer. The price of land is a little bit cheaper. You can get more bang for your buck in terms of you can get a larger house for a lower price. Typically schools are a little bit better because property taxes pay for those. And the houses that especially we see today, we have decent sized houses out in the suburbs, and they generate good property tax income. Lower crime rates, all of these things are better air quality. They're all parts of why people go to life in suburbia. All right, next, who are these people? Well, we said white middle class, mostly lower middle class or just middle class white Americans. We're talking mostly about families. All right. You're not going to see, even today, you're still not going to see a ton of single people living in suburbia. People don't need houses that big. When you are a single person around a bunch of families with kids, it's really not the most, fun way to live. If you're young and you're single, you want to be probably somewhere else where there's more entertainment purposes other than a suburb. So you have to understand, most of the people that were in suburbia, they're young couples with young families. And of course, most of these were white middle class Americans. All right, we talked about Levittown's, the nuclear family. Okay, so the ideal family at this time was basically a husband, wife, and two kids, maybe three. Certainly the number of children by the 1950s is increasing overall, right? We have the baby boom, and if we haven't talked about the baby boom, you should write down what you see on the screen here. You have the years from really 1946 up until 1960 are most of the years that we see the big baby boom in. So if you follow the graph down at the bottom, and I would say that most families by this time are having three kids. Remember that most the suburban houses that are built only have 2 bedrooms, so you effectively have 1 bedroom for the parents and 1 bedroom for the kids. And that kind of constitutes, like you can see up there for the Leave It to Beaver family, what we call the nuclear family. So mom, dad, couple of kids. All right, life in suburbia was very conformist. It was very homogenous. So ethnically, it was very homogenous. You're talking about white Anglo-Protestant America. You're talking about very much a consumerist group. These are people that have access to credit, they have decent paying jobs, and they see their peers constantly buying stuff, stuff for their babies, stuff for their kids. Really, these baby boom kids are the first generation to really live in relative affluence, something we kind of take for granted today. We see that. We also see tremendous pressure for families to kind of act the same way. And a great example of this is domesticity. Females of middle-class families were almost just outright discouraged to work. In fact, it was seen by society as a humiliation if you're a husband and your wife has to work. That kind of meant that you as a husband weren't able to produce for your family enough. And that was kind of a shaming thing. And so really the mom being at home was almost like a status symbol. Like, I have such a good job and I do such a good job producing for the family that my wife doesn't need to work. And really I guess in some ways that's good for a female that she doesn't have to work, but that's just in the workplace. You have to understand they worked very hard at home, raising children. There's very limited what we would call daycare options. A lot of that burden was placed on the mom. If you've ever had to do your own laundry or dishes or anything like that, it was really all thrust upon the female. And the female was supposed to provide a peaceful domicile for her husband. She was supposed to really subvert herself for her husband. So once we get to like the 1960s and early 1970s, we are going to see females in a way revolt from this and want to get into the workforce and want to have equal treatment and resent being so isolated in their houses in this domestic sphere. But as of the 1950s in suburbia, you're talking really about a true cult of domesticity. Okay, materialism. I talked about this in conformity of what we call keeping up with the Joneses. So if we see a family that has something cool or something we like, we need to get it too. And advertisers played upon that, and they really put a lot of peer pressure on one another in the suburbs to kind of dress the same way, to act the same way, to really conform to those social norms. Okay, talk about the baby boom. I think the height of the baby boom is around 1957. But this group, I think what's important to talk about them before I get to Dr. Spock are the pressures that they put on society and the impact that they had on society and still have on society today. So, I mean, when you have so many young kids being born, it's going to create a huge demand. And we talked about the economic boom of the 1950s. Well, think about like all the diapers they needed, the hospitals, the schools as these kids get old enough. And as this group has progressed its way through, American history, they have presented challenges to the United States. Now, this has been one of the most productive groups in American society as well. But for now, in 2021, what we're starting to see is a lot of these people, they have worked and they've started to retire. And so as many of these people have now retired by 2021, they've put a tremendous impact on things like Social Security, and they're really draining Social Security, and we've had to adjust as a result of it. So that baby boom generation is really kind of an interesting group. And as we get to the 1960s and 70s, this is going to be the very generation that is going to lead a lot of those rebellions against conformity that they experienced when they were kids. All right, one of the most influential books that is written during the baby boom generation was Dr. Benjamin Spock's Baby and Child Care. It's almost kind of funny to think about now, but during that time, the prevailing thought was for females and moms to create really a child-centered sort of upbringing, to where the mom was not really seen or expected to take care of herself. She was supposed to think all in terms of raising the kids. And I think probably when you're become a parent someday, you're going to realize that you do need to take care of yourself, and that you do need to make sure that you have happy things, and that you take time for yourself, and you help, take care of your own mental health. But that wasn't the prevailing view at the time. This was all about subverting, if you're a mom, subverting your own personal interests to the benefit of the kids and ultimately the family. And hey, maybe that wasn't the healthiest way, but that's what they thought back then. All right, the last thing about life in suburbia, and I think we probably know this, but it was very segregated. Even though there were African American subdivisions from place to place, typically they were lower income. We do have an emerging Black middle class, and they're going to be leaders of like the civil rights era. But for the most part, these suburban areas that start developing around the typical American city, they're very segregated, and they're very white. All right, next, we've kind of talked about this around the way, but really the 1950s, in a lot of ways, like the 1920s, is very much a consumer culture. And so we have, the television that is becoming, by the end of the 1960s, almost every family has a television. Consumption of houses, we've talked about this one, with help of the GI Bill of Rights and pent up consumer savings from Great Depression, World War II. And we see a tremendous construction boom in housing. I want you guys to focus over to the bottom right-hand corner, where you have a Westinghouse refrigerator. Now, not only are we starting to see things like the refrigerator and freezer, we're starting to see freezers for the first time, which is an amazing thing in terms of storage of food, but also advertising. Advertising, we talked about briefly in the 1920s. This was something that advertisers really hit the middle class hard during this time, and really made them believe, hey, these are the things you need to have. You have to have these things. This is what your neighbors have, and if you don't get them, you're not going to be kind of in the group. And so advertisers really went after middle class Americans really hard to buy these things, and a lot of times they bought them on credit. And so you guys can see an example of an early credit card, the Diners Club credit card that's up in the top right-hand corner. Consumer credit went up 800% during the 1950s compared to the 1940s. People were buying a lot of stuff on credit cards. But remember, because the economy was so good for much of the 50s, people had jobs, they could make their payments. And so it wasn't going to be a situation kind of like the Great Depression, where it kind of all just came to an end. And then, of course, probably besides the house, and the television, one of the things that Americans truly consumed in the 1950s was the automobile. And so you kind of look at that in concert with the building of roads and suburban growth. The vehicle really became a symbol of American freedom, of American culture. It proliferated the growth of motels and restaurants and drive-ins and all of those kind of things, shopping malls. And so that became a big part of American culture in the 1950s. Okay. As for women, we said that you have really this cult of domesticity, this time when married middle-class women were expected to be in the house, and they had very rigid gender roles during this time, very much a domestic one. Okay. We know that we have the soaring birth rate during the baby boom. A lot of women felt isolated. You can see here, I love this picture here. This is what's called a Tupperware party. And so, somebody would come in that was a rep for a Tupperware company. This was for food storage. And so these women would have these Tupperware parties where somebody that was selling Tupperware would try to have these women get together. But really, I'll tell you, all that Tupperware party is, it is a chance for isolated women to get together outside of a home and be around other women in kind of the same boat. This is just a social gathering. If you think of like the Grange back in the 1860s and 70s for farmers. The Grange was really a place where farmers could come together and commiserate and just have a social outlet. These are some of the things, book clubs, Tupperware parties. These are the things that women did to try to keep themselves from being so isolated, because really the domestic sphere was a time of isolation. Okay. All right. Now, if you are a single woman, remember that we do have this proliferation with our economy of different jobs, and if they weren't, strenuous physical kind of service jobs, a lot of women tended to flock to them. And so, kind of our traditional ones would be nursing. Now, at this point, teaching is starting to take over from males. We're starting to see, things like clerks and retail clerks, women that worked at stores and things like that, secretaries. Those are all kind of these traditional pink collar jobs that if you were at least a single woman, you typically worked. But like I said, a lot of middle class women, their husbands just flat out didn't want them to work, and then society put pressure on them. And I think this was in Housekeeping Weekly or Housekeeping Monthly, which is like a periodical that was very popular at the time. And let me give you just a couple of minutes to take some of these in, and you can have a good laugh at it in terms of, I cannot believe that our country was kind of like this at one time. But you see the picture of the ideal nuclear family, right? You've got dad coming home from work. You've got mom in her little conservative dress wearing heels at home. I can't even imagine my wife wearing heels at home. Today, my wife, she'll come home and she'll put on sweatpants or joggers or, yoga pants or something like that and slippers. But here you have in the 1950s, it's so formal, right? And you have the man coming home in his suit, and you've got your two kids, your nuclear family, mom's cooking dinner. And so, just let me give you a minute to read a couple of these, and I'll just kind of step back for a minute. Okay, you can continue reading. I'm going to point out two of my favorite ones, and that is because I think my wife would personally laugh at me if I had this kind of attitude. But in terms of what she should expect of me. So I'm going to go over to the right hand side. Make the evening his. Never complain if he comes home late or goes out to dinner or other places of entertainment without you. Instead, try to understand his world of strain and pressure, and is very real and needs to be at home and relaxed. And I kind of like the one at the end too, where it says, don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house, and as such will always be full of fairness, and truthfulness. You have no right to question his judgment. All right, so a couple of those, but hey, this is kind of what they thought at that time. All right. Now, remember that not all was great for Americans. We've mostly just concentrated on middle class, which, is a big portion of the American society, but doesn't represent all American society. And so, by this time, you're talking about 10 to 15% of most American areas are going to have African Americans that are a predominant minority group. And what we start to see, if you remember, is this continuation, this large migration called the Great Migration out of the South. And what they are going to do, and we talked about this in class a little bit, is they're going to fill those voids left in those inner cities Detroit, Chicago, New York, among other places, St. Louis, where those middle class white people have gone out to the suburbs. African Americans are going to fill into those different jobs, and so you start to see a number of African Americans who are going to go into factory work and things like that. Now, aiding to this migration was not only World War II, but once World War II ended, by that time we have a mechanical cotton picker that can do the work of probably 50 to 100 men. And so there's not as many farmhands needed on the former plantations. So a lot of those people they're just going into the north and going into the rest of the Sun Belt and places like that looking for jobs. And so we're going to see that this is going to cause social problems that politicians in the 50s and later the 60s are going to have to deal with. Now, in terms of Mexican Americans, we had this. I mean, I can't even believe that they called it at the time, but they called it Operation Wetback, which, if you're ever around people of Hispanic descent, you'd never want that. It's an insult. But this is what our government called it. They called it Operation Wetback. And during World War II, they had a work program where Mexican Americans were encouraged to actually come to America and work. And then after the war, they were encouraged to go back. And so many of these people, they wanted to stay. They knew that the pay was better. And a lot of these people started doing what's called circulation migration, where they would come up during the harvest and the planting and things like that, and then go home around Christmas or something like that until the spring planting was done again. And so this is going to continue to be an issue. It is really after World War II. I think probably the most important thing you should write down is that after World War II, we are going to see a significant increase in the amount of people coming from Mexico. And this is when that population starts to shift in terms of, hey, look, we've always been a country that has gotten mostly European immigrants. Well, now after World, that's going to change. And even today, our number one source of immigration is going to be from Mexico. So, that's, I think, probably the most important thing from this group is to say, hey, look, now our immigration statistics have started to change. People from Mexico immigrating is going to take over from Europe. All right. And then Native Americans, we have a continued discrimination to some degree against Native Americans. What was once called the Indian New Deal, that program is terminated, and we're going to see that Native Americans, this is not a great time to be a Native American. The American government, who had kind of tried to help you during the New Deal of the Great Depression and during the war, those programs are being terminated. All right, science and technology. This is a great time in terms of the movement of the creation of different technologies, and we've already talked about the television, so I'm going to move on with that. But we start to see the beginnings of computers, and you can see kind of an early computer there on the bottom left-hand side. I mean, some of the earliest computers were originally designed for military purposes. So breaking codes. So like breaking codes of the Germans or the Japanese. That's what they were using early computers for. But then they started using them to do mathematic computations and things like that. And circuitry and things like that, scientists were working feverishly to work on miniaturizing, any kind of circuitry for computers. And that paid off. As we will see, in the 80s, the 90s, now with personal computers, and now especially with your phones. So this is kind of the beginning of that. The first computers were, the size of an entire room, and now we have computers in the palm of our hand. 1952 is the creation of the hydrogen bomb, and I think it's important to point out that the Soviet Union's right on our heels. We had obviously dropped the bombs on Japan in 1945. By 1949, probably with the help of people that disseminated information to them, the Soviet Union had created their own nuclear bombs. By 1952, we create what's called a hydrogen bomb, which instead of splitting atoms, actually fuses them together. Fuses hydrogen together and creates a much larger bomb than the traditional uranium or plutonium fission bombs. By 1953, the Soviet Union has a hydrogen bomb. And so what we start to see is a great proliferation of nuclear armaments by both countries, which is going to be one of the defining features of the Cold War. 1959, we create NASA, and we do this to start science and space exploration, and we'll see that come to fruition in the 1960s. And then cures for various diseases. Probably the biggest one that we have is the cure for polio. And so the Salk polio vaccine became very important, in the lives of Americans to get rid of polio. I'm sure FDR would have loved to have had access to that before he was paralyzed. Okay, we talked about conformity. Here you can see conformity there. Really, the main causes of conformity are the large amounts of similar people living in suburban areas. And, the idea of fitting in with a group. You have such a large group, don't do things to stand out. You want to fit in. And whether it was in work, whether it was in something like advertising, it was something like the suburbs, you're going to find high levels of conformity. Advertisers promoted this in terms of, hey, buy this, and if you do, you're going to fit in. If you don't buy it, you're not going to fit in. But I think one of the interesting ones there is the fear of communism, and that is that you don't want to stand out. You don't want to do anything different. And communism was a different idea. And so I remember even when I was a kid, if you didn't kind of conform, somebody would say, what are you, some sort of commie? And that was just like kind of you making sure you would get in line with what the rest of the group does. So we had a lot of things that really fostered this conformity. And what we're going to see is that by the end of the 50s, we have writers like Jack Kerouac that are going to write out, these so-called beatnik writers that are going to write out about the problems with life in the suburbs and conformity and how it's making American life so homogenous and dull, and there's no individualism anymore, and there's no creativity. It's all just homogenous conformity. All right, so a couple of important books that probably you should know. One would be The Affluent Society, that is a critique or a criticism of this enormous wealth and prosperity that some parts of America has, while some other parts of America, like in the urban cores, they are really struggling in poverty. It was back in the 1920s that we originally believed that if we became so prosperous, it would just naturally eliminate poverty. And that certainly wasn't the case. And that was what Galbraith was writing about. Just alluded to the beatnik movement. It really is a response to conformity, what they felt was unnecessary consumerism, and the greed of America to have things, to have material goods. What's interesting is that the Beats, most of them were from prosperous families, from at least middle-class families, and they just really rebelled against the idea of having to conform to social norms. And so while most American males especially were expected to be, clean shaven and, wear their blue jeans and dress properly, a lot of times the beatniks were very bohemian, which is to say they drank, they smoked, they didn't always shower and take care of themselves. Many of them had beards. They were really rebels. Okay, so probably the two most famous of the beatnik writers in the 1950s are Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. You can see what they wrote. I think what is important too about the Beats is that they are the foundation for the hippies of the 60s and 70s. Okay, they really are. They are the inspiration for, the people that really start the hippie movement in the 60s and 70s. The Beats are the original hippies. Okay, probably the most famous art style that you can see, and I think it's a great example of, rebellion against the constructs. So you have like Andy Warhol. If you ever know Andy Warhol, we're going to see Andy Warhol a little bit later. But you see probably the most famous Andy Warhol would be I think it's the tomato soup can painting. Jackson Pollock, really with abstract expressionism. So these are things that start to challenge the expected or the conformity of the 1950s. All right, and then in music, really this is the start of the rock and roll era. Now, rock and roll really, for the most part, is inspired by a number of things. It's inspired by everything from country music, but really, I think the basis of rock and roll music comes from African American upbeat music, rhythm and blues. Even jazz probably played a little bit of an impression on early forms of rock and roll. And probably the biggest star of early rock and roll is going to be Elvis Presley. And by the 1950s, he has come to take American middle class values and say, hey, look, these can be challenged. And so, when he was singing, he would slick back his hair. He would wear leather jackets a lot of times. He would wear rolled up blue jeans. He would gyrate his hips when he would dance. And so, what I think is interesting about this picture on the bottom left hand is that you have these still kind of conforming teenagers, but yet they're not quite dancing like their parents, and they're kind of starting to rebel a little bit. And like American Bandstand, hosted by Dick Clark, these were some of the beginnings of this youth culture rebellion that we're really going to see take off in the 1960s. Okay, so it is very much so a reaction against these conservative values that we see throughout most of the 50s. Okay, that is it for Society of Post-War USA. Thank you for tuning in, and then make sure that you watch the next video lecture, which is a focus on politics of the 1950s, foreign and domestic.